Well, good morning. I'm sure that the attitude for some this morning is somber as we've lost a dear brother in Christ, Brother Glenn McGee. And so I'm cognizant of that this morning as I address you. I've heard great things about Glenn even before I ever arrived here and about the long history that he's had here with this congregation. And so we weep with those who weep this morning. There are other people who are going through other things this morning as well. Sister Pat is 2 weeks in to Ed being gone. Ed texted me this morning, and he's headed to Ras Des Salam for the rest of the week after today, which is one of the fastest growing cities in the world. Very diverse city. There are Chinese moving there and Muslims, and of course it's an African country in Tanzania. And so it's a great opportunity for the gospel because of its diversity. So we keep him in our prayers. We have people away from us who are traveling today. I think the Flemings are all up in Kentucky and Bailey's down in southern Alabama, at least some of them. And so some are traveling. And yet some are rejoicing too. We have, Sister Laura here and Sister Riley just graduated from UNA. And so their long time of having studied there and worked through the pains of study and tests and the stress and the anxiety of all of that is now finished. And so we rejoice with them, and we're happy for them here today. But I'd ask you to, if you can, for just a few moments, clear your minds of all of those things that are going on in our lives, and maybe there's other things, and open your Bibles up to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, and we will be studying there and studying quite a bit of the context of this passage here today. I'm preaching this lesson, and Clay doesn't know this, but it's because Clay was in my house a couple of weeks ago, and he kept saying, I'll become all things to all people. He said this a couple of times, and so I asked my wife, I said, what should I preach on this next week? And she said, how about you preach on becoming all things to all people? Because since Clay said that so many times, it's in my head now, and so we want to study that and take a look at it. The Apostle Paul's text in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, it's one of the most powerful, and yet it's one of the most misconstrued texts in all of Scriptures. It's powerful because it's the best type of winning. It's about soul winning. And so for that reason, it's a wonderful passage for us to consider and to try to imitate as best we can. But it's a dangerous text because it's a text that has led to some wild conclusions about the proper strategies that we may take to accomplish this admirable victory of winning souls to Jesus Christ. And so let's read the text and consider it in our time today. 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 19. I know Shane just read it, but I think it's good to reread, keep it fresh in our minds. It says, though I am free from all men, I have made myself a slave to all, so that I may win more. To the Jews, I became as a Jew, so that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, though not being myself under the law, so that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law, as without law, though not being without the law of God, but under the law of Christ, so that I might win those who are without law. And to the weak, I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, so that I may by all means save some. I do all things for the sake of the gospel, so that I may become a fellow partaker of it. So as we contemplate this message of Paul today and its context, I want us to come to grips with Paul's role as an apostle. I want us to consider his perspective in preaching. I want us to consider his aim in preaching. And I want you to think about his strategy that he reveals here in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Then we're going to make a few applications as we take Paul's writing to heart. Now, as we read this text, I think it's important for us to, first of all, just consider the role of Paul. We need to be reminded of who is doing the writing. And Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 1 who's doing the writing. He says, Paul, called to be an apostle of Jesus Christ through the will of God. And so this was the same Paul who was first discipled by Ananias. This was the same Paul who was told by Ananias in Acts chapter 9 and verse 15. He told, Go, for he is a chosen vessel of mine to bear my name. And so this was going to be Paul's role. It was to bear the name of Jesus before Gentiles, kings, and the children of Israel. Do you see Paul's role in that one verse? You're going to take the gospel of Jesus and you're going to share it with Gentiles, with also the children of Israel, that would be Jews, and even with kings. And Paul did exactly that. So Paul was not preaching on his own authority. He was a messenger for Jesus. We understand his role as we look at passages like that. Take a look at one more role passage. It's in Acts chapter 26, verses 17 and 18. And as Paul himself recounts his conversion, he says that Jesus said to him during his conversion in verses 17 and 18, I will deliver you from the Jewish people as well as from the Gentiles. Do you see Jews and Gentiles? God is telling Paul, I'm going to rescue you from the attacks of Jewish people and also the attacks of Gentiles. So Paul's going to be doing something dangerous here that he's going to need to be rescued from. But he says, I am going to send you, to whom I now send you, to open their eyes. They were blind spiritually. They needed their eyes open. To turn them from darkness to light. They were living in darkness. They needed to live in the light of Jesus Christ. And from the power of Satan to God, that they might receive forgiveness of sins and inheritance among those who are sanctified by faith in me. Clearly, these passages set up the role of Paul when we look at the larger context of Scripture. His role was a messenger of Jesus, and he was to take the gospel to Jews and the Gentiles to bring people to Jesus, but it wasn't all going to be lovely. Sometimes he was going to need to be rescued from these very people he was trying to share the gospel with. And so Paul was a witness of the resurrection, a messenger of the saving message of the risen Jesus to all peoples. I want you to notice that Paul understood his role, not just as we look at these larger contexts, but look at the specific context of Corinthians. So let's narrow down the context a little bit and look at 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Paul asked the question in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, am I an apostle? Am I not free? Now, there's two things going on there. I'm an apostle, okay? And so that means I'm a messenger of Jesus. Am I not free? You could perhaps take that in a couple of different ways. Perhaps it's just that he's a freed man and that he's a Roman citizen, which has been referred to in the book of Acts as well. Have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? Are you not my work in the Lord? Yes. The answers to all of that are yes. Yes, you're an apostle. Yes, you're free. Yes, you have seen Jesus. And yes, the Corinthian people are your work, Paul. So yes, 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 and yes to all those questions. But he views himself in other ways besides just an apostle. Look at that in chapter 9 and verse 7. In verse 7, he says, whoever goes to war at his own expense. Now, he's actually referring to himself. He's a soldier of Christ who's in a battle for souls. He's at war. He says in the next phrase, verse 7, he says, who plants a vineyard and does not eat of its fruits? Paul was a farmer. Paul was a vine dresser, and he was trying to bear fruit in God's vineyard. Then notice the third question. Who tends a flock and does not drink of the milk of the flock? Well, what is someone who tends a flock? He's a shepherd. So Paul views himself as a soldier of Jesus in a war for souls. He's a farmer bearing fruit in God's vineyard. He is a shepherd of God's flock seeking to protect the sheep. And he's doing all of that without pay. And that's one of the main points of chapter 9. He refuses pay for all of these roles. He had the right to receive pay, but because he didn't want to be attacked by the Corinthians for being a peddler of the gospel or doing it for pay, he refused pay. And that's important to keep in mind as we look at the broader context of 1 Corinthians 9. But Paul's role chiefly is to be a soul winner. I want you to consider this is not a role for the weak. This is not a role for the timid. It takes toughness. Soldiers have to be tough. Farmers have to be tough. They got to work in cold and rain and heat and with difficult ground conditions. Shepherds have to be tough, sometimes sleeping out in the fields with their flocks. They have to be tough. They have to fend off and fight off certain animals. And so you've got to have some toughness in order to play this role. Now, because Paul had this role, he viewed his role with a three-pronged perspective, and I want you to see his perspective in the context. He viewed it, first of all, as a privilege. Look at chapter 9, verses 14 and 15. He says, even so, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. But I have used none of these things. The idea of preaching the gospel, living of the gospel, is that those that you preach to, you should be able to receive support from those that you preach to. That's the principle he's laying out in verse 14. But he says, I have used none of these things. I haven't taken pay from anybody that's in Corinth there. I have used none of these things, is what he's saying. I had the right to, but I chose not to. Nor have I written these things that it should be done so to me. He said, I'm not writing because I want you to pay me. That's what he's saying in verse 15. And if you look at the larger context, you see that really borne out. He says, it would be better for me to die than that anyone should make my boasting void. No, he's saying, I actually view it as a privilege that I can preach the gospel without having to ask for your support. Now, we do know that Paul did receive support for his work from churches like Philippi. In fact, he tells Philippi in chapter 4 that nobody supported me concerning giving and receiving except for you only. So that's the only New Testament church that we see Paul receiving pay from when it comes to doing his work. But he refused pay from Corinth because he viewed it as a privilege just to preach the gospel, whether there was money involved or not. He also saw it as a duty. Look at verse 16. He says, if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of. For necessity is laid upon me, and yes, woe is me if I do not preach the gospel. So he had this responsibility to share the gospel, and he sees it as a privilege, but he also sees it as a duty. This is my responsibility. I have to do this, whether there's pay involved or not. I feel burdened to do this for the sake of lost souls. But he also sees the preaching of the gospel as a reward. Look at verse 18. What is my reward then? He uses that same term reward later in the context as well. So Paul has a great task, and he views his task with a great level of seriousness as an apostle. Now you have to consider that before you can get to the specific text that we're looking at. His role is to preach and to teach the message of Jesus Christ. He views that as a great reward. He sees it as a duty. It is a privilege that he was even selected as a sinful person who was once anti-Jesus, and now he is proclaiming Jesus. He sees it as a privilege that he was even selected to do this. And whether he would ever get paid for it or not, he wants to do it for the sake of winning lost souls. So why does he do it? Well, that's where we get into his aim. And we start to see his aim in verses 19 through 22. Paul's role was an apostle, but we also learn of his goal. So we've got his role and we've got his goal. And his goal is he's preaching the gospel because he wants to see souls saved. Notice the term win. It's found 5 times in verses 19 through 22. You should maybe underline it every time that you see it or circle it or whatever you do with verbs. But his goal is to win people clearly. And when you see a word repeated over and over again, that's for us to notice. That was what he wanted to do. He wanted to win. But what does that mean? When he says that he wants to win people, what does that mean? He wants them to like him? He wants them to hang out. What does it mean? Well, if you take a look at verse 22, I think it unlocks the meaning of what type of winning we're talking about. Verse 22 indicates that winning is saving. You're winning people when preaching the gospel to them leads to saving people. So look at verse 22. It says, to the weak, I became as weak that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men. Why? That I might by all means save some. He wanted to save people. He's preaching because he wants to see the lost saved. And so this is the best type of winning. It's greater than your team winning the college football playoff. It's better than your team winning the high school state championship. This is the best type of winning. Winning lost souls to Jesus Christ because it's eternal winning. It's forever winning someone to the Lord. Now, why and what was the means of this winning? How do you do that? How does Paul do that? Look at verse 23. He says, this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be partaker of it with you. What's the means? The means is the gospel. Now, I want to point out a couple of things. When we talk about Paul being to the Jews as a Jew, to those under the law as those under the law, to the weak as weak, a lot of people have taken that passage and they think that that means that Paul was just wanting to have a good time with a diverse bunch of people and that he got people to like him. His goal is not that. His goal is not just some earthly peace or harmony or to have a fun time with diverse people. This means winning people. Means far more than simply befriending them or hanging out with them or just doing some fun stuff with them. I like what Spurgeon said on this point. He said, "Observe, brethren, if I or you or any of us or all of us shall have spent our lives merely in amusing men or educating men, when we shall come to give our account at the last great day, we shall be in a very sorry condition. Of what service will it be to him to have been amused when the trumpet sounds?" What's he doing with these people when he's winning them? It's not just trying to get them to be his friends. He's trying to open doors of opportunity so he can preach and teach the soul-saving gospel to people from this diversity of background. Now, please think for a moment about Paul's goal and ask yourself this question. Is it your goal? Is it your goal that you would try to save every person that you come in contact with in your life? Now, you might be thinking, well, that's Paul's job. That's not my job. I want you to look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And I want you to see that he puts it in the lap of the Corinthians when you read 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Look at verse 32. He says, "Give no offense either to the Jews or to the Greeks or to the church of God." That sounds very similar to what he's talked about in 1 Corinthians 9, right? He says, "I became to the Jews as a Jew, to the Gentiles as a Gentile." And he says, "You now." He's making application to the Corinthians. You, don't give offense to the Jews, the Greeks, or the church of God. "Just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved." And then chapter 11, we a lot of times start chapter 11 without the context of chapter 10, and that's a mistake because chapter 11 is connected to verse 33. "Imitate me, just as I also imitate Christ." What's he telling the Corinthians? Just like I became all things to all people, just like I became to the Jews a Jew, and to those without laws, those without law, just like I became to the weak as weak, just like I give no offense, because I'm very careful not to create a stumbling block between me and the opportunity to teach the gospel. You imitate me, just as I also imitate Christ. You also need to put this into practice then, is what he's saying. And so, Paul's not talking about just himself here. He starts with himself as the template, as an example. He moves on to the church and says that you've got to practice that. In fact, back up to verse 31 of chapter 10. "Therefore, whatever you Corinthians, whatever you eat or drink, or whatever you do all to the glory of God." Why? Because you need to imitate me, because that's how I've been practicing in my life. And that's what's going to help you become more effective in winning other people to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so, yes, this goal of winning people and saving people and talking to people about the gospel should be our goal as well. And so does this effort of winning others to Jesus matter to you? Is it important to you? Well, here's why it should be important. Look at Romans chapter 5 and verse 9. Just notice a few verses with me. We'll jump around to a few texts. Romans chapter 5 and verse 9. It says, "Much more then, having now been justified by his blood, we shall be saved from wrath through him." Why should it matter to you? Because those who have not yet turned to Jesus Christ are under the wrath of God. That's what they're being saved from. That's why we want to save them. We want to save people from the wrath. That's why this is the best type of winning. Rescuing souls from the wrath of God. 1 Thessalonians chapter 1 and verse 10. That same idea is presented to those in Thessalonica. 1 Thessalonians chapter 1 and verse 10. It says that we want to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, even Jesus, who delivers us from the wrath to come. We're saving people from the wrath to come. That's why this work is important. And that's why it should matter. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 9. God did not appoint us to wrath. God instead, he appointed us to obtain salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ. That's why sharing the gospel with people, the good news that Jesus came so you didn't have to face wrath. He came and took the punishment for you. And if you would just turn to him, you can be saved as well. That's why that message is important to be shared with people, because souls hang in the balance. And so saving requires the gospel, and we should be involved in sharing the gospel. Well, how did Paul do that? Well, Paul had a strategy, and here's what he says in summary is his strategy. He says that I became all things to all men. A couple of the newer versions say all things to all people. So what exactly does that phrase mean? I become all things to all people. Because if I'm supposed to imitate Paul, then I need to understand what he did. Well, let me notice a couple of things that it doesn't mean, and it cannot mean. It doesn't, first of all, mean that we bend our message to another gospel. It doesn't mean that we bend our message to another gospel. Paul rebuked those. If you look at Galatians chapter 1, verses 6 through 10, when there were people who were trying to present another gospel that was more palatable to their audience, he rebuked them for it. He didn't compliment them. He didn't say, good job, you're becoming all things to all men. You're changing the gospel so that it's more likable now. No, Galatians chapter 1 and verse 6, he says, I marvel that you are turning away so soon from him who called you in the grace of Christ to a different gospel, which is not another. There are some who trouble you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ. Even if we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel to you than what we have preached to you, let him be accursed. As we have said before, so now I say again, if anyone preaches any other gospel to you than what you receive, let him be accursed. Verse 10, do I now persuade men or God? Do I seek to please men? And so whatever becoming all things to all men is, it's not seeking to please men by changing the gospel for them and making it something different. Paul says, I didn't do that and I don't do that. He says, if I still pleased men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ. I would have betrayed my role as a slave to Jesus Christ had I tried to change the message for the sake of other people. Take a look at Galatians chapter 5 and verse 11. And you'll notice there that sometimes when Paul preached, people saw the cross that he preached as an offense. And so we cannot change the message of the cross, even if it is offensive to some. Verse 11 says, I, brethren, if I still preach circumcision, why do I still suffer persecution? And then the offense of the cross has ceased. And so to some, the cross was an offense, but Paul was still willing to suffer persecution, though some were offended by its message. And so that's not what it means. It also doesn't mean bending our morals. Bending our morals. It doesn't mean that because I want you to like me, I'm going to change my language to try to fit in with you so that you think, no, I'm a cool guy. I'm going to cuss like you cuss, and I'm going to talk like you talk, and I'm going to tell the dirty jokes like you tell, because I've got to become all things to all men to fit in, right? I'm not going to change my lifestyle. I'm not going to affirm sinful lifestyles. I'm not going to become an ally to sinful lifestyles. That's not what it means. Yet that's what a lot of people in our religious world today, that's how they're applying this become all things to all men passage. I cannot change my language, and I cannot change my lifestyle, and I cannot change my moral laws, or the moral laws, most importantly, of God, to become more accommodative and affirming to an anti-Christ culture. Again, Paul is the one in Romans 12 who demanded, be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. He demanded that we not conform to the sinful things of this world. So that's not what he means, or else Paul contradicts himself in two different passages. You remember Peter before the resurrection of Jesus Christ? Peter denies Christ 3 times. What was it that Peter did in denying Christ? Well, one of the things he did is he started cussing and cursing like all the people that he was around to try to get people to believe, well, maybe you're not a follower of Christ. Maybe we're wrong. Was Peter commended for that? Good job, Peter. You're becoming all things to all men. No, those were the actions of a traitor. That's not something to imitate. That wasn't something that was commendatory about him. So what does it mean, becoming all things to all men? Well, in context, Paul was willing to make certain sacrifices within moral boundaries in order to diligently do his job of soul winning. And he actually provides two examples within the 1 Corinthians 9 context. One of the things that Paul refused to do is he refused to get married. Did he have the right to get married? He does. If you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 9, he points that out. He says, verse 5, do we have no right to take along a believing wife, as do also the other apostles, the brothers of the Lord, and Cephas? Cephas, by the way, is Peter. Well, the Catholic Church would argue that Peter was the first pope. The Catholic Church also requires that popes not be married. That's not consistent with Peter. Peter had a wife. Peter was married. And Paul says, I had the right to be married, but I refused to do that. Do you know why he refused to do that? For the sake of the kingdom. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, he teaches, and which is also part of this context, right? If you go back 2-3 chapters, he teaches that one of the reasons he chose not to be married is because he could focus more on how to please the Lord instead of being focused on how to please his wife. He could dedicate himself more to kingdom work by his singleness. And so he says, if you're able to be single, I encourage you to be single, because these are the benefits of singleness in God's kingdom. But he also refuses, a second thing he refuses, is he refuses pay from Corinth. He had the right to be paid. He makes that point in the context of 6-12. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 6. He says, is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working? Now, Barnabas was extremely wealthy. You read about that in Acts 4. He's able to actually sell some land to give to those who are in need. And so clearly Barnabas is still working and supporting himself, just like Paul was making tents and supporting himself in that way while he did the kingdom work. He says in verse 8, do I say these things as a mere man? Does not the law say the same also? It is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. Is it oxen that God is concerned about? No. We're talking about if an ox is treading out the grain, feed the ox so he can keep treading out the grain. And the idea is if preachers are doing the preaching, if apostles are apostling, then they need monetary support so that they can feed, shelter, and clothe themselves so that they can continue to do the work. So don't muzzle the ox that treads out the grain. Verse 11 says, if we've sown spiritual things for you, is it a great thing if we reap your material things? And if others partake of this right over you, verse 12 says, are we not even more? But notice verse 12. Nevertheless, we have not used this right. We have the right to be paid by the church, and we have refused it. And we endure all things lest we hinder the gospel of Christ. How would it hinder the gospel of Christ that you took an income? Let me ask you something. Have you ever heard somebody say, I don't trust preachers because those preachers, they're just doing it for the money. They're just a bunch of greedy people. The church is just a bunch of people who just care about your money. Yeah. Were people in Corinth possibly saying things like that? Paul's just doing it for the money. Paul did not want anyone to ever say that about him. And so he says, I refuse to take pay from you because I don't want that to be the accusation. And I want you to know I'm sincere in sharing the gospel with you. And so if that's going to be a hindrance to the gospel, then I'm not going to do it. What a wonderful privilege. What a wonderful thing to be able to do that. It wasn't a requirement, though. It was a sacrifice that he made so that these things would not become a hindrance to those that he was preaching to. Verse 19 might be the best explanation. He becomes all things to all people. And how's he do that? Verse 19 says, by making himself a servant to all, that I might win them more. When he did that, he sacrificed himself for the sake of others and not the message. So what does it mean that Paul became all things to all men? Well, here's what I think it means. There were times that Paul had to modify his habits, and times that he had to adjust his lifestyle, and times that he had to set aside his preferences for the sake of meeting people where they were to win them. For the sake of meeting people where they were What it means is that Paul was willing to make sacrifices and Paul was willing to serve. Now let's see how we can illustrate this with what Paul shows us in verses 19 through 22. Consider some ways that Paul accommodated people as he taught. He says, to the Jews, I became as a Jew. What does that mean? Does that mean he pretended to be a Jew and agree with their religion? Not so. Because if you look at passages like, look at Acts 9, right when Paul converts to Jesus Christ. Verse 22, it says, Saul increased all the more in strength, and he confounded the Jews who dwelt in Damascus, proving that this Jesus is the Christ. Did he pretend he wasn't a follower of Christ in front of the Jews? No, he actually was trying to tell them that Jesus is the Christ. What happened because he did that? Look at verse 29. He spoke boldly in the name of the Lord Jesus and disputed against the Hellenists. These would be Greek-speaking Jews, but they attempted to kill him. They didn't like the message that he taught. So Paul didn't compromise the message. But what were some things he was willing to do? Paul was willing to go to the synagogue if that's where he could find listening ears. And so while he didn't have to keep the Sabbath anymore, he chose to go to the synagogue because that's where the Jews were on the Sabbath, because it gave him the opportunity to teach people there. What else did Paul do? Well, he didn't berate their holy days or insist that they eat unclean foods. Well, we don't have to eat, that strict diet anymore. Y'all can have some catfish now, some barbecue. He didn't do that. He didn't put them down because they were not eating certain things. He didn't demand that they violate their conscience regarding the Sabbath. If they didn't want to work on the Sabbath, then, don't work on the Sabbath. Romans chapter 14 bears this out in a lot of detail. And it talks about being careful that we not judge other people or become a stumbling block in the area of liberties. You are allowed to take Saturdays off if that's what you want. That's a liberty. You don't have to. The law doesn't require it now under Christ, but you can. You can read scripture together on the Sabbath day if that's what you still want to do. If you still want to maintain this diet that you grew up having, you can still maintain this diet. And it's not going to come between us and our fellowship together in the kingdom of God. So he met Jews where they were and grew their faith without insulting their traditions. It says also that to those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. What's that mean? Well, Wiersbe writes this in his New Testament outlines, and I think this is a great quote, and we're just going to use it to try to help explain what's happening here. He says, though Paul enjoyed liberty as a worker, he willingly made himself the servant of all men that he might win them to Christ. This does not mean that Paul followed the worldly slogan, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. That would be compromise, rooted in fear. Paul's attitude was based on love, not fear. He was not lowering his standards. Rather, he was laying aside his personal privileges. It was not hypocrisy, but it was sympathy. He tried to understand those who needed Christ and enter into their experiences. He was a Jew, so he used this as a key to open the Jewish heart. He was a Roman citizen, so he used this as a key to open the door to the Gentiles. But it doesn't mean that he soft-soaped the gospel for the sake of the Gentiles. Again, notice another passage in Acts. Notice what happened sometimes when Paul taught the Gentiles. Sometimes he got attacked. And he got attacked because he didn't back off the message of Jesus. In Acts 14 verse 19, Jews from Antioch and Iconium came there, having persuaded the multitudes. They stoned Paul. They dragged him out of the city, supposing him to be dead. Look at chapter 17 and verse 24. It says, God who made the world and everything in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands. What was he saying to these Gentile people? The way that you're viewing God is not the right view of God. Let me show you the right view of God. Some people mocked and belittled him, but he still taught them. But when Paul taught a Gentile, he didn't ask for a different food. He didn't refuse to talk to the Gentiles just because he found some of their habits to be disgusting, and that wasn't how they were raised. Like Peter, Paul would have to learn not to call any man common or unclean so that he could share the gospel with them, just like Peter had to learn that. And then Paul says that to the weak, he became as weak. And so we're talking about Jews, we're talking about Gentiles, and we're also talking about weak, perhaps novice Christians. So what does it mean to the weak he became as weak? Well, back up a chapter, and I think this might be the easiest to see in context in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. Because this text is really part of such a much bigger context that when we study the context, helps us understand what's going on. Paul is trying to point out in 1 Corinthians chapter 8 how the Corinthian Christians may have the liberty to eat meat from idols' temples, but doing so could be a stumbling block to the weak. So you have a weak Christian who sees you eating meat that came from an idol's temple, and they might automatically assume, well, you must be an idolater. You must be okay with idolatry. No, that's not what it means. You're making an unjust assumption. But because some people make unjust assumptions and untrue assumptions, then Paul says sometimes it may just be best not to eat the meat that's in an idol's temple. Just for the sake of your weak brethren, because you don't want to create a stumbling block and a point of division. Take a look at 1 Corinthians chapter 8, and I think you'll see that borne out in the text. 1 Corinthians chapter 8, notice verse 9. He says, beware lest somehow this liberty of yours, in other words, it's your right to eat meat from an idol's temple. But beware lest that liberty of yours become a stumbling block to those who are weak. If anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in an idol's temple, will not the conscience of him who is weak be emboldened to eat those things offered to idols? And because of your knowledge, shall the weak brother perish for whom Christ died? He said, when you thus sin against the brethren, wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. And therefore, notice Paul's conclusion in verse 13, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never again eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. Was Paul not allowed to eat meat? No, he could. But he says, if it's going to cause my brother to stumble, if they're going to think that because I eat meat that came out of an idol's temple, that all of a sudden it's okay for them to practice idolatry, then I'm not going to eat meat at all, because I don't want to be the reason why they slipped back into idolatry after they had left idolatry to become a Christian. So I'm not going to do things. So to the weak, I became as weak. I went ahead and listened to their conscience, and I obeyed it myself for the sake of winning them. So in service to others, Paul denied himself certain rights and liberties and accommodated others to create a foothold for the gospel. Now, notice something that Paul says, because I want to apply this and bring this to Christ. Paul says that when he's doing that, he's imitating Christ. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, imitate me just as I also imitate Christ. So it seems like what he's trying to get across to us is that Jesus Christ sometimes denied himself to serve others and sacrifice for others and gave up certain rights and privileges for the good of others. Now, can you think of some ways that Christ did that? Let me give you a few. John 4. And I'm just going to go through this really quickly with you. But in John chapter 4, Jesus sits by a well of water. He makes it a point to travel through Samaria and sits by a well of water. And he has a conversation with a Samaritan woman. Now his disciples are going, why are you talking to this Samaritan woman? Why is this happening? Why were his disciples saying that? Because for one, men didn't talk to women in the middle of the day sometimes. For two, they didn't talk to Samaritans, certainly in the middle of the day. That was taboo. That was off limits. And she was a sinful woman who had had 5 husbands, and so she perhaps had not so good of a reputation. But Jesus breaks all of those barriers. None of those things were Jewish laws. He wasn't breaking the law, but he was breaking people's traditions and customs, and he was even breaking some of the expectations of others to talk to a woman, to talk to a Samaritan woman, to talk to a sinful woman. And what was the result of Jesus going to Samaria and talking to that woman? That woman left her water pot, went into the city and said, come and see a man who told me everything that I ever did. And the entire city of Samaria is won to Jesus Christ because Jesus was willing to set aside some of the customs and traditions of his people for the sake of winning a lost soul. In the Gospel of Luke, there's numerous examples of Jesus becoming all things to all men so that he might accomplish his mission of saving the lost. In Luke 5, we read about the call of Levi, which would be Matthew. And Jesus is sitting in a house of tax collectors and sinners. A lot of people didn't like that. I would imagine that for a lot of religious people, it'd be uncomfortable to sit in a house of tax collectors and sinners and people that had a bad reputation and maybe didn't look like them. But why did Jesus do it? To win them. In Luke 7, he lets a sinful woman weep all over him and wash his feet and touch him in the presence of Pharisees. Why does he do that in the house of Simon the Pharisee when clearly Simon the Pharisee is offended by it? To win her to Jesus. In Luke 15, Jesus is again being ridiculed because he's eating with tax collectors and sinners. Why? Because he was wanting to let them know, I'm cool with your sin. I'm good with you sinning. Is that what was happening? No, because he wanted to win lost people to Jesus. And so then he tells these three parables, the lost sheep, the lost coin, the lost son, to demonstrate that our attitude towards lost people coming to Jesus should be rejoicing in happiness, and we should be willing to become all things to all men so that people can be saved. In Luke 19, Jesus sees this little short tax collector up in a tree, Zacchaeus. And he says to Zacchaeus, hey, I'm going to your house today. And the rest of the people, do you see what they're whispering? Surely he's not the Son of God, because he would know that he's going into the house of a sinner. But why did Jesus go into the house of a sinner? Because he was trying to bring that sinner to saving faith in Jesus Christ. What's the application for us? We must learn what it means to become all things to all men so that we might save some. Paul's teaching tact to make contacts. Understand what it takes to get into the presence of other people's lives so you can bring the presence of Jesus into their lives and win them to Christ. And so we learn it from Paul. We learn it from Jesus. So I'm going to give you just 10 practical steps really quick as we finish up. What do we have to do to become all things to all men? Well, let me mention number one, go where people are. Lost people. Go where lost people are. Acts chapter 16 and verse 13, you see Paul doing that. He went to places, whether it be the synagogue or whether it be the marketplace for the Gentiles. He went to places where lost people were, where he could have conversations with people to bring them to Christ. Go where people are. Eat what other people eat. God, that's a tough one for some people, right? I would love for you to sit down when Ed Brand gets back, and I would love for you to let him talk to you about things that he has had to eat in other countries in order to not offend the people that he's eating with. Right? I remember my dad going down to Belize, and in Belize, they served him chicken feet. They were eating chicken feet, and he ate chicken feet for the sake of not offending the people that he was eating with. Maybe there's people here that eat chicken feet, but don't try that on me, because I don't know if I'm as good a person as my dad. I don't know if I'd eat your chicken feet, but you got to eat what other people eat sometimes and what they set before you so that you don't break any opportunities to share the gospel with them. Listen to understand. James 1 says, let's be swift to hear, slow to speak. Listen, so you understand where people are. What are their objections to the gospel? What are their objections to the church? What is it that they're struggling with that you can help, that Jesus can help? Know where they are so you can know where to start. Be willing to study and start where they are. That's what Paul does when he goes into Athens. He realizes that these people don't even understand God. They don't even have the right concept of God. I don't need to start with Jesus. I need to start with God in Acts 17. And so he starts with the proper concept of God. God is not a man who sits in temples made with hands. God is far beyond and greater than that. He starts where they are. Speak up. You're going to have to talk to people. When there's people who are lost and you have the saving message of Jesus, then you're going to have to be willing to speak up and share the gospel. Paul does that. I imagine he was shaking in his flip-flops while he was doing that. But he speaks up and shares the gospel in Athens, even though people are mocking him and making fun of him for what he'd said. But some people believe. He got through to some people. Respect their morally neutral customs. Okay? It may be that if you go preach in Africa at some point, there are certain people who dress a certain way, and when you walk into the assembly, they may expect you to dress a certain way. They may have certain customs that you need to obey. If you try to go preach the gospel in a predominantly Muslim country, you better be willing to wear the things that they're wearing in predominantly Muslim countries so that you don't get yourself killed and so that you don't offend some people. You're going to have to respect some of these morally neutral customs in order to share the gospel sometimes with people. Respect also the fact that you're going to have to give up your time to serve and to sacrifice for others. This is going to take time. So if you're going to become all things to all men, you're going to have to spend time with those other people. You're going to have to make time for them. Make them a priority. That's what Paul's talking about in 1 Timothy 4:16. So people have to become your priority, especially people where you have doors to share the gospel with. Make them a priority and overcome prejudice. Peter and Paul had to overcome some prejudice against the Gentiles. Paul actually had to rebuke Peter because when he was talking to Gentiles and no Jews were around, he kind of acted like they were fine. And then when all of his Jewish buddies showed up, he acted like he wouldn't sit at the same table anymore. Peter was still working through some prejudice. Barnabas was still working through some prejudice. And Paul made it very clear, you're being a hypocrite. And these people can be part of God's kingdom just like the Jews can. They are every bit as much your brother as anybody. And so you need to overcome that prejudice if you're going to become all things to all people. But finally, grow your passion for winning. Grow your passion for winning. You know, when I was a younger man, I loved sports. Played baseball, played basketball, played in the backyard every day. I loved winning. I loved sports. I was competitive. But when I realized that sports, first of all, you get older. First of all, secondly, you start getting beat by people because you're older. And sports really aren't the be-all, end-all of life. And I started taking that competitive nature and realizing, why don't I start putting that competitive nature into something that actually matters for people's eternity and start trying to win people to Jesus. That matters far more than winning a game or my team winning a game. I don't really care about that stuff that much. It's kind of funny to me, actually, that we get all worked up about it. I care more about winning lost souls to Jesus. That's who I'm fighting. Fighting Satan. I'm trying to overcome what he's done to people, to people's hearts and souls and lives. And I just want to share Jesus with them. Put your energy and passion into winning people to Jesus. Do you share Paul's aim? Do you share his strategy? Do you share his passion for winning the lost? And if so, what are you doing to seek and to serve the lost in our community? Are you searching for opportunities? Are there people that you're praying for? Start praying for people in your life that you want to come closer to Jesus. Are there people that you're trying to come alongside, making time to get around them, to have the opportunity to share the gospel with them? I heard this great story from Frank Turek, who I don't agree with everything Frank Turek says, so I have to throw that caveat out there, but he made a point about someone that was on his staff. Frank Turek lectures in different colleges and tries to share evidences for why, the gospel is true. But he said there was somebody on his staff. She was an older lady, and she started working at Starbucks. Now, I don't know about you, but the typical worker that I find in Starbucks today, because Starbucks generally has a somewhat liberal agenda, typical worker usually isn't of the same mentality as me. But he said, I had someone on my staff, and she went there and purposely worked at Starbucks so that she could have the opportunity to talk to people who were of differing views and to show them that Christians aren't all crazy and weird and nutso people. And so that when those doors of opportunity came with the questions that she knew they would ask, she would have the opportunity to talk to them about the gospel. That's what we're talking about, becoming all things to all people. Finding ways to get into people's lives, be near them, even if they're different from you, just so you can have those open doors to talk to them about spiritual things. Are you passionate about that and looking for those opportunities? I hope that you are. And may we take whatever measures are necessary to sacrifice our rights and our privileges and create opportunities and make accommodations where we can open doors for the gospel. Are you evangelistic enough? I guess that's what I'm asking. Are you being evangelistic? I'm going to level with you about something. Right now. Came here to Alabama. I get asked this question a lot here in the last couple of weeks, especially. How do you like Alabama? I like Alabama. I've liked everywhere I lived, to be honest with you. and I like it here. What is one of the challenges here in Alabama compared to other places I've lived? There are a lot less visitors walking through the back doors of this church from unchurched people compared to any other church I've been at, which is partially because you got a lot of churches down here. But partially, could it be because we need to try to be more evangelistic, sharing the gospel with people, studying with people, inviting them to come. I want to preach the gospel to the lost. I don't want to just be a keeper of the aquarium. I want to be fishing for men who are out there who are lost, who need Jesus. And so that needs to be part of our emphasis. That is the church's emphasis. Go and preach the gospel to every creature. Take the gospel to the lost. I want that. So I have a challenge for you today. In the back, I know I've talked too long. Sorry. In the back, there's these little cards that sit there, and they have our times of service and things like that. Here's just a quick, good start. Grab yourself 5 of those cards and invite 5 people this week. Church. Ask them to come. Maybe ask them to come study with you if they're not comfortable walking into a church building. Yeah, that's a good place to start, really. And you think about those cards, you take 5 of those cards, and you consider those 5 cards represent 5 lost souls. 5 lost souls who need Jesus. And I want to make sure that I at least hand out 5 of these things to people who I'm working alongside, or people who I see in the store, the person who's my waiter or my waitress today. And you do what you can to share Jesus with somebody, and just the opportunity to preach Jesus to somebody. And you start watching, you'll start seeing people who look different and people who have a different background religiously, and you'll start seeing them walk into the back doors. You'll start seeing that you have opportunities to teach them. Why? Because you're thinking about those souls becoming all things to all men. Let's make an effort to do that. Well, I talked long enough. Are you in Jesus? And if you're here today and you're not, we would invite you to come and be a follower of Jesus Christ so that you might be saved, so that you might have eternal hope and be saved from the wrath of God. And if you haven't yet made that decision yet, we invite you to come while we stand, while we sing.